Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Maryland Tech Council Executive Series. I'm Marty Rosendale, CEO of the Maryland Tech Council. And this afternoon, we have with us Tim Sheflin and Brad Stewart, who are going to help us understand the complicated nature of the U.S. healthcare market. If you've joined us, it's probably because you understand that the U.S. represents the largest and most complicated healthcare marketplace in the world. And so getting the strategy right, understanding that market, understanding the complexity of those dynamics can be really helpful. Our executive series is brought to you by the Maryland Tech Council and the BioHub. This afternoon, as you're watching the presentation, if you use the chat function or the Q&A function, I will be monitoring it and we'll take your questions there. We'll also have a period for questions at the end. So our two presenters this afternoon, Tim Sheflin is the Executive Director with Boston Healthcare, now a part of Veranex, and Brad Stewart, the Senior Vice President of Business Development for Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation, and the Chairman of Maryland Life Sciences. Combined, have more than 4 decades of experience commercializing medical therapeutics and technologies. Tim is an expert at the design, conduct, and analysis of payer research that produces insightful and actionable strategies. He also designs tactical reimbursement launch plans and needs assessments for specialty drug companies whose products require physician reimbursement support and payer accounts management. He has developed and produced over 100 payer research programs, facilitated in-person manufacturing and payer interactions, and participated in manufacturer presentations to commercial evaluation committees. Tim has extensive experience in developing market access strategies for tests that aid in early cancer detection, personalized drug treatment choices, identification of sexually transmitted diseases, women's health, and the detection of gastrointestinal disease. In addition, he has developed strategies for novel diagnostic imaging modalities used for detection, treatment planning, and surveillance. So an amazing background for our discussion this afternoon about strategy. And Brad is a serial biotech entrepreneur now working to grow Montgomery County's economy, which approaches $100 billion per year and is the leading economic driver of Maryland. Brad leads an expert team of economic development specialists focused on growing a diverse cross-section of businesses, including the life sciences, technology, cybersecurity, defense, and hospitality. Brad also chairs Maryland Life Sciences and is vice chair of the Maryland Tech Council. I've known Brad for a few years, so I can tell you he is a fearless leader who's invested his career in building and turning around life sciences companies to maximize shareholder value, and he thrives on complex strategic opportunities. So Brad and Tim, welcome this afternoon. And Brad, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Marty. And I appreciate Tim being here with me because I think we're going to take you on a journey of complex opportunities, because that's certainly what the U.S. healthcare market is. To give everyone a few frames of reference for this discussion, I'm going to talk about why we're talking about it and why it should matter to people, and then what we hope to get out of this. We're located here. I'm located here in the state of Maryland, which is on the East Coast of the United States near Washington, D.C. I'm in Montgomery County, which is a suburb of DC, and we're very fortunate here to have 2 of the largest agencies of their type in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, which most people are familiar with, which is the largest regulatory body for healthcare in the world, and the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest researcher of human health in the world. So we'll talk about a little bit in a minute about the payment system in the US, but one of the things that, to give you an understanding of what we want to try and cover is, we frequently have people who come to us who realize they want to do business in the United States. They're trying to put together their models for what the marketplace is like, what they hope sales will be like, so they can go out and pitch to investors and get people to invest in their companies, allow them to develop products. But that usually comes with almost no understanding of the complexities of that marketplace. We're not possibly going to be able to answer all of those questions in this discussion, but what we hope to do is give you enough orientation so that you get a sense of how you need to think about those models as you begin to model out what your investments might look like, what your returns might look like. And more importantly, as you move farther down that pathway, you start to look for people like Tim who can actually help you put together those strategic plans and actually execute them and help to bring these products to market. So anything you want to add to Tim before we start?
No, that sounds great, Brad. And Marty, just wanted to thank everybody for the opportunity to speak with everyone today.
Well, thanks, Tim. So we talked about the United States, and sometimes we get a little bit of flack here about being sort of US centric, and it's not always undeserved. But to give you a little bit of context, I talked about how Maryland headquarters the largest researcher and the largest investigator of human healthcare. It also headquarters the largest payer for human healthcare in the world. So on this graph, you see the size of spending of healthcare in the United States. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is the largest payer for healthcare services in the US, has about $1 trillion per year budget and is located here in Maryland. As you can see, that makes up about a third of the US healthcare market and influences a much larger portion of healthcare spending in the United States. The US has a $3.5 trillion per year market, which is the reason it's usually number one on people's lists of interest in pursuing. What's even more interesting and was even shocking to me when I went back and plotted this out, that $1 trillion of healthcare that's paid for here in the state of Maryland is greater than the healthcare spending of every country on the face of the earth. And as you can see, the amount of healthcare spending in the United States dwarfs the total of almost every other country combined in the world. If you look at the United Kingdom through Australia, just the $1 trillion that occurs here in Maryland through Medicare and Medicaid exceeds those altogether. So it's not just that we're US centric in the US, it is the largest purchaser and consumer of healthcare services in the entire world. So from a commercial perspective, it's critically important to understand how to bring products to market here and what that's going to look like from a modeling perspective and from an economic perspective. So from my perspective, when we start to think about these things and we start to put together models for investors or financial models, typically what I see is people looking at a very simple sort of value. The market size is just the patients times the price. And that tends to severely overstate the likelihood that you're going to have for the market. And that's really what we're going to spend some time talking about. In reality, your sales dollars end up being, from my experience, a product of three different things. The addressable patients, that's out of the number of patients who have disease, can actually be treated. Are they actually diagnosed? Do they have access to healthcare? Is the drug something they can take? If they're a place that has poor healthcare and you're selling an intravenous drug or something that requires significant refrigeration, that's unlikely to happen. Penetration of the percentage of addressable patients, how many you're actually able to get on your therapy. That can be driven by the competition you have out in the marketplace, awareness of the disease. And then last but not least, net price. Not just what you want to sell a drug for, but how much do you actually get to keep in your pocket at the end of it. So we'll try and talk a little bit about each of these as we walk through this discussion. So there's a lot of different ways to start the discussion. I think about it strategically from the beginning. You know, how do I start to figure out how to develop my drug, what my indication is going to be, what my competitors are, and how I engage the community that's out there in using my drug. That, in my mind, typically occurs with key opinion leaders. These are really the thought leaders that help to drive awareness and utilization of drugs, as we'll talk about a lot of other things. Just because someone's a high prescriber doesn't mean they're a key opinion leader. And I think it's important, you can buy databases of physicians who utilize almost any type of drug, and high volume prescribers are ones that are clearly valuable from a market perspective. They're not necessarily ones who drive a lot of decision making among their peers or other groups that influence utilization of your drug. These key opinion leaders more frequently are at academic medical centers, places that are teaching centers, doing large scale clinical trials, et cetera. They're possibly federal researchers, so they can be located at the National Institutes of Health, or they could be R01 grant recipients that are located in academic medical centers. They also could be medical society leadership, people who lead the medical societies in whatever specific area of medicine that you're working in. And Tim, you want to talk about advisory bodies?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, you know, obviously leading the field and leading areas in advanced science and groundbreaking new technology or treatments is part of the role of publications, part of the role of an academic medical center. These folks are incredibly important beyond that role when it comes to a lot of the decision-making made by a highly fractured set of advisory bodies. So in a very clinical perspective, obviously, key opinion leaders are going to be incredibly important in developing treatment protocols at hospitals. Oftentimes, those are even published online or posted online that can be a reference for a whole bunch of other organizations who are looking for leadership in understanding how to interpret new and innovative technology. Pharmacy and therapeutics committees are groups that look at formulary determinations and access to drug organizations at the hospital level, but also at the private payer level. It's not uncommon, especially if you're talking about rare and orphan disease or innovative indications, for physicians at academic medical centers to be brought into a CMS work group or to be brought into a private payer pharmacy and therapeutics committee on a consulting basis. And they have a huge influence on many of those types of decisions. And then in terms of some of the mechanics of actually getting a claim process and the process of a physician or a hospital being reimbursed for the adoption of a new technology or the use of a medical device, for example, the coding and payment rulemaking organizations within CMS, within the American Medical Association, within the HCPCS work group, some of these acronyms may be completely foreign to you, but these groups are actually incredibly important in bringing together the opinions of the key opinions are incredibly important in swaying some of these, at times, I don't want to call them arbitrary decisions, but at least there's a judgment call where they're looking for key opinion leaders to make a clinical determination. And, next, I want to talk a little bit about the payer environment. I think when we talk about payers in the United States, there are several things to keep in mind. They are a completely different set of stakeholders with a completely different set of key endpoints they're looking for or key evidence they're looking for than the regulatory agency. So the FDA is going to make a determination about what is safe and efficacious. They are not going to dictate to payers, to CMS, to private payers certainly, whether or not that is something that should be brought into a member's benefit or a beneficiary's set of covered benefits. And the determinations that they make are oftentimes looking at different standards. Medicare looks at a reasonable and necessary standard. There's not necessarily a cost component to that standard, but they are going to make judgment calls as compared to things like the standard of care and determination if it's something that will fit within the benefit for Medicare beneficiaries. Private payers may talk about a medical necessity standard. And in that circumstance, they are very free to look at things like health economic endpoints, looking at cost effectiveness, looking at budget impact. All of these organizations, and in terms of some of the determinations they make, are data driven. It isn't always aligned with the data that's being required for your regulatory approval from the FDA. And that could be an incredibly frustrating aspect of bringing a medical device or a product to market in the United States, but it's the truth as well. Payers will, remain the ultimate skeptics. If you have something that improves compliance, does that compliance actually improve outcomes down the line of one course of therapy versus another course of therapy? And they will demand different levels of data of you in order to provide the ultimate access to those patient populations that Brad was talking about when it comes to building up your market models and understanding what percentage of the eligible patients from a clinical perspective are going to have access to a technology. And as my colleague at Boston Healthcare often says, Tom Goss, our VP of Health Economics and Outcomes Research, he heard this quote from a payer. He builds it into a lot of his presentation. I thought it was good here as well. In God we trust, and all else, and all others bring data. Another key aspect of it in the United States is it's highly fractured. You have large, significant payers like Medicare, who is predominantly looking at the 65 and older population, retirees, and those who qualified through disability, under the auspice of, or under the umbrella of the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. They are looking over Medicare, they are looking over Medicaid, which looks at the indigent populations and those that are qualifying through income levels and their children. Those that payer is a little bit more uniform in terms of we have a lot of publicly available information on their decision-making process, on their fee schedules. As soon as you move away from that population, most folks in the United States get their insurance through a collection of thousands of plans that are privately run. Commercial plans is what we characterize them, that are looking to sell group plans, mitigating risk for large group employers. Sometimes they have self-insured employer plans where they're really just acting as an administrator of claims and a builder of a provider network. And even these individual companies can have several different hundred offerings that they're making to fit their customer base. Their customers may be a very large tech company in the United States. It may be a series of smaller consultancies in the United States. It may be very small businesses where their employees are looking at buying individually purchased plans. And as a result, they can act and behave differently, and they're not monolithic. Building full universal or near universal access at the commercial level oftentimes requires a multitude of steps to get different types of plans to agree to cover a procedure that requires the equipment that you're selling, or to pay for a drug before failure of a generic. All of those different types of things, these plans have a huge influence on. So I touched upon this earlier, and I think Brad touched upon it as well in his graph looking at healthcare spend. CMS and the Centers for Medicaid Services is an incredibly important payer. It represents the largest single payer in terms of dollars in the United States. It also is something that if there are significant healthcare laws to be changed, it oftentimes goes into monumental changes in rules and laws for the overall Medicare population that have downstream effects for insurance regulation and healthcare regulation at large. Medicare is not a program, it's the law. It's something that in order to change it requires a change in the law, requires both houses of Congress and a presidential signature. So it doesn't move as quickly and adeptly as it maybe some private plans do. But when they make changes, it has a long-standing impact across the system. They also are the most transparent payer in many different ways. And their payment systems, their payment rates, the way they pay hospitals, the way they pay providers, the way they pay for provider-administered drugs, for retail drugs that you pick up at the pharmacy. Those things are typically far more transparent in terms of what those rates and payment systems are than anything provided by commercial players, at least in terms of data that's publicly available that you're not purchasing from a private plan. So as a result, they are the benchmark for individual contract negotiations between provider groups and individual payers, individual hospitals and individual payers. And so that fracturing of the US market becomes even more pronounced the further you move away from Medicare, because the types of plans that are available and the types of contracts that providers have with payers or hospitals have with payers can have some consistency. The most important consistency is they usually are somewhat being negotiated off of this publicly available information. One of the things, if you walk away today in thinking about, well, I have a medical device or I have a drug, the way that pricing and reimbursement mechanisms vary between medical benefit, things covered by a plan's medical benefit versus a pharmacy benefit, they're two completely and entirely different animals. On the pharmacy side, you're really talking about reimbursing for what we would call retail drugs, things that people are picking up on the pharmacy. This is where your chronic medication is going to come into play. This is where your medications that people are going to self-administer is to come into play. And that's one entirely different system than the medical benefit. And for example, at my company, I get my medical insurance through one company and my pharmacy plan through a pharmacy benefits manager, a completely different company. In both cases, they're subsidized by my employer, but the rules that apply to what I'm responsible for and what isn't covered are entirely different. The medical benefit side oftentimes is what we're talking about is reimbursing providers, reimbursing hospitals for their time, their expenses, their purchases for purchasing these types of capital equipment or disposable equipment that you as a manufacturer may be selling directly into your customers.
So we're going to talk a little bit about drug pricing. And as you're already starting to see, this gets to be pretty complex and varies widely depending on what it is you're actually selling, whether it's a device, a drug, or anything else. Even more importantly, it begins to change when you talk about where the drug is or the device is utilized and how it's going to be paid for. So when you start to think about drug pricing, which is one part of that model of, what are you going to be selling your product for? There's the theoretical price is really the value of the drug. And that's really, I think people from the industry always say, well, I should be paid based on the value of my drug. That value is literally to the payer, the pharmacoeconomic benefit of the drug. So if you're going to believe that you're going to price your product based on its value it provides, that's going to have to be some calculation of the pharmacoeconomic benefit that it provides. Is that going to be a reduction in the use of other healthcare products? Is it going to replace other drugs? Is it going to replace surgery? Is it going to reduce morbidity, mortality? Those sorts of things which demonstrate, quite honestly, in the healthcare payer's mind, a reduction in their costs. So they're literally looking for an offset to expenses they would have otherwise have had if they have not paid for your drug or your product. So that's sort of your starting point. That's the greatest price you can imagine getting for something. So what's your realistic list price? Well, that's really bounded by pricing of alternative therapies. So you may have a theoretical price for something or something that's based on a pharmacoeconomic benefit. But if the alternative therapy is a generic drug, if you're making a hypertension drug and there's a generic available that's pennies a day for therapy, you've just had a boundary set for what someone's willing to pay for your product. And that's going to go into that pharmacoeconomic benefit because the payer is going to assume that their alternatives are that generic drug or lack of treatment or something else. Next is going to be your net price. So your net price is what you actually get to keep, not what you charge people, but what you get to keep in your pocket. We'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. That's going to be bounded by economic givebacks. In the United States, we have a large and complex system of chargebacks, of rebates, different fees that go to different people. It is hard to comprehend and explain why the system exists as it does, but let us assure you that it does. And so the real issue is when you get to looking at your pricing, it's how much will you actually get to keep in your pocket at the end of the day, not what you're actually going to try and sell the product for. And then there's actually floor pricing in the United States. There are some complex laws which establish minimum prices you will want to charge for a product. Medicaid has legislated rebates that are based on minimum pricing of drugs to commercial providers. And there's also a program called 340B pricing, which is pricing to indigent hospitals. These prices actually establish what a manufacturer is willing, the lower end of what they're selling, willing to sell a product for to a commercial payer, because it will drive those prices lower, sometimes incredibly low. An important thing to think about, we talk about the pharmacoeconomic benefit of a product, a drug, or anything else you're doing. That's not information that comes from a phase 3 clinical trial. You just can't take trial data and present it to a payer and hope that they're going to accept that as a reason to pay for your drug. You really do have to start to think ahead of time of how you're going to price a product, how a payer is going to decide to pay for it, what evidence you need. And you really need to build that strategy into your clinical trial strategy, typically separately or in addition to what you need for regulatory purposes. It is very common for people to come into the market and have, as we talked about earlier, a drug that's approved by the regulatory authorities, but then payers won't pay for it. And so you've accomplished an important benchmark, but you have no revenue to show for it, which is difficult to explain to investors and shareholders. And so the other thing, pharmacoeconomic data from one country may not be applicable or relevant in another country. So if you are doing pharmacoeconomic analyses in other countries, whether it's for NICE in the UK or other bodies around the world, that may not be relevant to payers here in the United States, and something important to think about as you put together your development strategies. So what are things that really drive price other than the value or pharmacoeconomic benefit of it? They're frequently driven by point of use. You'll find that in the United States, the type of drug you have, whether it's used in an outpatient setting or an inpatient setting, is going to change dramatically how the value of that product is used, who's going to be paying for it, whose budget it affects, which costs it offsets. And then outpatient drugs can vary significantly depending on whether they're oral or injection drugs or whether they're infused. So for outpatients, really the biggest payer of these are going to be payers or the employers. When payers, we talk about the healthcare insurers is how some people might refer to them. We have also in the United States employers who are self-insured, who are large payers also. In those cases, Tim already mentioned pharmacy benefit managers. These are groups who negotiate pharmacy benefits on behalf of payers. And so they may bundle together basically a formulary of drugs that are available to different health plans as a negotiated service, and they'll negotiate with the manufacturer themselves over pricing. This is where we get to list price versus net price, the price at which you tell someone you're selling the drug at versus what you actually get to keep in return. So that net price includes different rebates and chargebacks that occur in the value stream. Some of those are based on volume. Some of those are based on formulary placement. Do you want your drug to be first line therapy, second line therapy, third line therapy? And then access restrictions and copays. There are some drugs which are very high priced, but almost impossible for a healthcare provider to use. Or the copays are significant enough where a generic may have no copay and your drug might have a $40 copay, and the patient themselves decides that they don't want to invest that money in your drug versus an alternative. What really drives inpatient drug pricing and utilization? Diagnostic related groups, which Tim will talk about in a little bit, DRGs. These are sort of episodes of care which bundle the entire cost of caring for a patient when they're in the hospital. Bundling of products. You clearly see this across medical devices and drugs. Large companies have a multitude of products they can offer to a hospital or hospital system. And so they'll make sure that the combined pricing of those are favorable for drugs they want to make sure get priority utilization in hospitals. Group purchasing organizations. These are groups that purchase on behalf generally of hospitals or hospital systems and combine purchasing volume to drive down cost and negotiate pricing. And then as Tim talked a little bit before, formularies, which can be in hospitals, hospital systems, or PBMs to control utilization of drugs and availability. This is a not simple diagram that's just here for illustrative purposes, but unfortunately, this is actually a real example. This is an example that Pharma put together probably 2 years ago to sort of illustrate the flow of money in the circumstances of drug reimbursement in the United States. As we talked about before, we're generally talking to people who are on the producer side. So you've produced a drug for high blood pressure in this case that sells for $100. And as I talked about before, that's your list price for the drug. The real question is, what is your net price? What do you actually get to keep at the end of the day? In this circumstance, the patient paid a $40 copay. The result of that, though, when you look in the red here, is the manufacturer gets to keep $62 of that $100 spent on this medication, or the list price. So again, it's very important to begin to understand these things as you model out what your markets may look like, what your financial opportunities may be, and realize that, again, your list price is not necessarily what you're going to get to keep at the end of the day. So Tim.
Thanks, Brad. And I'm going to speak to a little bit about how things change on the device side. And I think just sort of leading off, the ability to set your price, whether it be list or whether you're keeping track of your distribution channel to understand what your net is ultimately going to be, is a little bit trickier on the device side. And that's because oftentimes the financial stakeholder or who's at risk for the purchase can change pretty dramatically depending on things like, Brad was talking about the inpatient versus outpatient setting of care. When you talk about medical devices, they can be used in multiple different settings of care. They can be used in mixed in a blend, sometimes inpatient, sometimes outpatient. And the systems in which hospitals and providers are reimbursed for those particular services in that setting of care, can vary, and it oftentimes will do things to say, the further you get away from a hospital inpatient environment, for example, the more insulated from that purchase a provider might be. if a provider is doing something in the physician office, they may be able to bill a fee-for-service type of payment, make a fee-for-service type of claim. So each time they perform something, they know they are getting something back if it is covered. Each time they use something, they know that a portion of it is coming back each time they use it. The further you get towards the inpatient side, you will see more and more bundled payment systems where the financial stakeholder is really shifted towards the provider. A plan might say, yes, you can use, an MRI or an X-ray for this inpatient stay, but frankly, it has nothing to do with us because we are going to come up with a single diagnosis-related group payment. So, this is just a list of examples of the different things that CMS is required by law to come up with prospective payment systems that are designed to vary by setting of care to deal with the different cost structures and deal with the different overhead and deal with the different expenses that even the same procedure might have, whether it's taken place at a major academic medical center in an urban area or something that's maybe taking place at a physician office in a rural area. The United States is a diverse country in many different ways, and the payment systems and all the different settings of cares are certainly a way to reflect that. In one form or another, people oftentimes will ask us, well, if we get a code, we'll get paid, or how important is coding? Coding is a way to access these systems. The appropriate code, having a CPT code or a HCPCS code or something like that, is a way to access these systems and to trigger a payment. It is not necessarily a statement of coverage. So for example, here, this is a bundled payment system that is probably reflective of a lot of European systems as well in terms of inpatient stay. Everything that's involved, which drug you choose, what type of lab tests you choose, what type of imaging tests you choose, regardless of what happens here on the far left-hand side of the column, based off of a series of diagnoses or combinations of diagnoses, one payment. The hospitals get one payment for that, regardless of whether somebody was there for 3 days or 10 days. There are exceptions to many of these rules that Medicare makes available for new and innovative technologies. And knowing these things on the right side and understanding how a new technology add-on payment may play into the first 3 years of product adoption is an incredibly important thing to understand. Even when procedures are paid via a more line item, fee-for-service, provider risk insulated type of system, say in the physician fee schedule, for example, when somebody's performing a service in their office, the cost of a specific devices or a component of a technology is still somewhat bundled. This limits the manufacturer's ability to set the price in these circumstances, in part because if you have a technology that fits into existing procedure codes, for example, and you're not eligible to come up with a new way to report it via a new code, that price has been set by the legacy of that code, and changing that can be very, very difficult. Even for new technologies, manufacturers can set the price of goods, but that's baked into a broader formula determining how much on a fee-for-service basis a provider may actually get. And I think that's where those KOL relationships come into play. The American Medical Association, the specialty societies, they work directly with CMS to survey their population to understand, at times down to the minute, down to the second, down to the cost of surgical gloves, down to the cost of rent in a particular city. Those very, very specific inputs are going into a broader formula to determine exactly what the payment should be. So relationships with key opinion leaders and providers who have influence in that process is critical to making sure that you don't enter an environment where providers will be underwater or be having to be in the red each time they use your technology. And this is kind of a classic example. This is just two sets of inputs in terms of what goes into a physician fee. And this is actually a partial list of the highest cost items that goes into the cryosurgical ablation of the prostate, CPT 55873, right? That's what a provider would be submitting as a code to tell a payer, to tell Medicare what they performed. Now, this calculation also involves things like physician work, the amount of time associated with subclinical staff, nursing staff, pre-procedure, post-procedure, intra-procedure. But if you look at the level of specificity that they are seeking, on the far left-hand side, this is 10 of a 31 item supply total by the cost of the individual item. When our client is looking at something and saying, oh, okay, well, the cost associated with this, we want to charge $8,200 for our kit, right? Well, the cost of the existing cryosurgical ablation of the prostate kits is averaged at about $4,700. And Medicare is going to look at all the manufacturers providing it. So if you have a significant advantage, a clinical advantage, an advantage that you think should dictate that a higher payment rate is going to be required to meet your COGS and to provide that product where a provider is not going to be underwater, that's where it goes back to that quote. If you have that about with all else bring data, if you have information saying that your technology is more accurate, it's going to reduce side effects, that is going to have to be collected in a believable, oftentimes required to be published form for payers to consider it, and for the AMA and CMS to consider it in determining whether or not a new CPT code may be required. But you can see how specific some of these things get into. We just did one a while back ago about a motility study, and it had things like, a radiologic tracer needs to be ingested with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and it had a line item. One, peanut butter, 2 slices of bread, and then had that calculated down to the individual cost of 2 slices of bread. So at times it can be incredibly specific, and understanding and trying to replicate this is a key function, especially if you're going in to say, we actually deserve a premium over the standard of care technology from which these costs were based. Having that data to show that you actually can defend that premium is going to be critically important. Not that it's safe and efficacious, which the FDA will have given its clear approval on, but that it is either reasonable and necessary against the standard of care, or that it's medically necessary against the standard of care, maybe even cost efficacious from a private payer perspective.
Thanks, Tim. And last but not least, diagnostics, which is where I've spent another part of my career, is another area where we see a lot of development going on around the world and new types of diagnostics that are out there. In the US, we have a system that's getting better, but not necessarily designed to handle these sorts of things. Most diagnostic products are paid for under what are called CPT codes, current procedural terminology. And essentially, these are a fee for an act of work. So it can be pipetting something, a specific reagent, those sorts of things. And generally, most diagnostic tests in the US are viewed as inexpensive or cost centers, which have specific steps which occur, which are paid for each step. And then every year the government looks to drive down the cost of those, assuming that you'll make that up in efficiency, which is why you see in most hospitals or most outpatient centers, these types of common tests, CBCs and other things like that, being done on larger and larger pieces of complex equipment where the objective is to get the highest throughput, lower the cost as much as possible, and to try and make high volume, low profits. Internally, again, when you're talking about inpatients, a lot of times they're, again, part of diagnostic related groups. So if it's imaging or something like that, the payer may not care what you use because they're not going to pay you for it. They're just going to pay you for the outcome of the patient. The patient has a heart attack, broken arm, whatever it may be, they're going to give you a fixed fee, and you're responsible for taking care of the patient, and they'll evaluate you based on the outcomes of those patients. Again, there is some interest in pharmacoeconomic benefit. There are a lot of higher value products that are out there looking at the ability to detect cancer, avoid cancer, predict the risk of cancer, genomic markers, those sorts of things. Again, almost always those are going to have to be have some pharmacoeconomic benefit to justify the price, or what they're causing the healthcare system to not have to spend as a result of that diagnostic, or the result of it. And then Medicare has a clinical laboratory fee schedule, and there's been in the last few years some work on ways to pay for more genomics type diagnostic, those sorts of things. That's a whole nother topic we could spend hours on. So we reach our favorite part of this. We've left time to answer any questions. Again, this was intended purely to give you a very general overview as you begin to think about strategically the US market. But we certainly want to take the time to answer any questions you have and try and delve a little bit deeper where it's helpful for you.
So, Brad and Tim, as long as I've been doing this, and it's been about 40 years, I'm always amazed at how complicated our reimbursement system is in this country when I see it presented like this. So I want to ask everybody, if you've got questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll take them. I have a question for you, Tim. You talked about when the manufacturer or developer has a product that they think deserves a premium price or needs to drive a premium price, and that they need to collect data and compare it against the standard of care. Who determines the standard of care? How do you determine that before you design the clinical study to gather that evidence?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. There's no single answer to that. In a lot of circumstances, when we're working together with clients, the standard of care may be dictated or at least referenceable in many key areas. The specialty societies will put out their own guidelines in terms of what they feel the standard should be in working up a patient and treating a patient, whether it's the AAN or the cardiology. They will have their own set of guidelines about what the standard of care should be more routinely. A lot of times those guidelines are very firm. Other times they are very soft, and it's very hard to compare against something where they say this, you may do this, that, or the other thing. There is no good standard of care. And sometimes they even will say the standard of care is get somebody enrolled in a clinical trial. You see that in oncology all the time. Other standards are going to come oftentimes, at least when we're trying to understand what endpoints to compare against and what the benchmark should be. Private payers and Medicare will put out information about technologies, about certain therapeutics, about diagnostics through coverage policies. Through Medicare has a regional type of process where the individual Medicare regions can come up with local coverage determinations. When those conflict, oftentimes Medicare will come in and make a national coverage determination through a national coverage determination process directly through the agency. And then individual private payers will have their own health technology assessment groups within them. Their technology assessment groups will come up with coverage policies that can be incredibly detailed. They will say that, yes, this type of intervention is covered against, the standard of care under these circumstances. When somebody has failed less conservative, less aggressive treatment or less costly treatment. When somebody has a documented failure of generic medication, you'll see that on the pharmacy side as well. And they'll use those policies to try to drive utilization towards techniques, procedures, equipment, modalities that they consider the most effective use of the healthcare dollar. They'll look at that from a clinical perspective, but they'll also look at that from a health economic perspective. And in those policies, a lot of times they will cite the papers that they are citing as the standards, the meta-analyses that they've looked at, the RCTs that have been part of publicly peer-reviewed publications in medical journals. And that will give us a sense of exactly what the standard of care is. However, certainly in the world of diagnostics, you can run into a situation where the standard of care is, clinical observation and some urinalysis that has been part of what's being taught in medical school for the last 30 or 35 years, and it's not very accurate. And that can be a really difficult thing. There are ways around that as well. But yes, understanding this and using that publicly available information oftentimes can be a means to set up something from which to compare yourself to determine that your technology is superior.
Great. And I think something I'll add to that, Marty, Tim was talking about diagnostics. One of the big challenges with a lot of these newer diagnostics people are looking at is they're also going to want to look at what unintentional costs you create for the healthcare system. If you have false positives for a test, and that causes you to then believe someone has prostate cancer, as an example, and start to intervene when they don't, that's certainly going to be a part of the cost they're looking at, the use of your product adding to it. And I think as far as standards of care, oh, sorry, Tim, do you want to add?
No, go ahead, Brad. I thought you were.
Yeah, and I think as far as standards of care, one of the areas that I think is probably not only most challenging today, but can continue to get even more challenging is in oncology. This is an area that there were very clear standards of care that were very slow moving. People knew what was primary, secondary, tertiary care for these types of cancers. And there's so much development going on in the field of oncology, particularly in immuno-oncology, that those standards of care are evolving constantly. And so you're, in many cases, sort of aiming at a moving target. So there really has to be a clear understanding not only of what the standard of care is today, but as it's going to evolve going forward as you're looking to get these products paid for.
And the last thing I was going to add, if you indulge me for one more second, Marty, the other thing to keep in mind in terms of what type of investment you're going to have to make in post-regulatory evidence development, it has a lot to do with the indication, the size of the population. It's not just the standard of care, the level of evidence you need to displace something, in type 2 diabetes, that's the standard of care that has huge implications broadly across the healthcare system, is going to be very different than the level of evidence you might need to say that you can identify in an orphan indication with this diagnostic a good percentage of people who are not going to get benefit from it and have side effects with costs associated with them. That can be a much smaller study, and a much, maybe that's not a randomized comparison. Maybe that's a series of case series where a payer says, okay, well, we don't need that significant of the standards that we might need to see to shift care in type 2 diabetes.
Mm-hmm. So, gentlemen, you didn't spend much time talking about generics, but we do have a question that's come up with respect to biosimilars. Any thoughts or comments about pricing of biosimilars, where they should be or are placed on formularies, and how they should be approached?
I'll start and then let Tim get into the meat of it. I think the first question is, how many biosimilars are there in the US? I think the reality today is it's still a market that people don't clearly understand from a regulatory perspective. There's been a lot of interest in it. I'm not sure there are a lot of people on the market successfully with real biosimilars or generically equivalent biosimilars. There may be products that are similar biologically, but typically they've gone through a standard biologic license application rather than some abbreviated BLA. In general, though, I would think if you did have a real biosimilar that was being used as a, in quotes, generic to a reference drug, when those products initially come out, people are typically looking at a price of about 80% the list price of the equivalent drug. And then behind the scenes, there's inevitably an inordinate amount of discounting and pricing and bundling and contracting that goes on. Tim?
Yeah, and over the years and all the market research I've done with payers, they have been generally disappointed with what biosimilars has represented to them on a dollars and cents standpoint. 80% of the reference price is something that's great, but it's not what they were hoping for and envisioning in terms of the potential drop in price and downward pricing pressure that, say, a third or even fourth brand coming onto the market in an area where there are multiple brand alternatives, and then that going generic. The amount of discounting that takes place on the retail drug side, oral drug side, when a generic becomes available is a significant drop and downward pressure in price. In the biosimilars, there very rarely are areas where you have more than one biosimilar competing against a reference, and that in many cases minimizes their motivation to say to a provider, you have to use the biosimilar before using the brand. And that's something that payers can do in the drug world, certainly when you're talking about the retail drug world, where there are multiple brands available and multiple generic suppliers, in some cases, dozens of generic suppliers putting downward pricing pressure, where the payers are reaping the benefit of that in terms of the whole category dramatically dropping in cost.
And there's a problem that we see there in generics here in the United States. It may also be elsewhere, but once there's multiple generics available for an oral drug, typically what you'll see is the price start to drop very, very rapidly. And over time, it just becomes a competition, people selling high volume of drugs with low margins. One of the challenges that we've seen in the US is then once that sort of market bottoms out, many of those generic suppliers then abandon the market. They stop manufacturing the drug. And then we end up on the other side with drug shortages because you're left with a single generic manufacturer making the entire supply, that if they run into any problems, all of a sudden the drug's not available. So and I think that's a realistic challenge people view as risky for biosimilars too, which is obviously a much more complicated manufacturing and regulatory process.
And one comment to add on to that as well, on the med device side and in the physician administered drug side, it is much more difficult to have significant changes in price up or down over a relatively short period of time. The scenario that Brad was talking about, where you have multiple generic companies suddenly stop producing, and then you have a single source generic company that's raising their price pretty dramatically. The way the reimbursement mechanisms are on the med device side certainly is it's historic pricing information and historic invoice information that's being used to set the right for the future. And something like a CPT code, right, the action code or verb code from a provider standpoint, those are only updated every 5 years. So you have a dramatic increase in your price because your competitor is out of business. You know, in that radio frequency ablation example, it's not going to be reflected in the provider payment rate for years. So a dramatic increase in price just puts them in an underwater situation and turns your customer into a situation where they have to decide, well, maybe rather than radio frequency, I go with cryoablation or whatever it is. Those types of things have to be planned out, looking at incremental changes over a much longer period of time, as opposed to on the retail or oral self-administered drug side.
Brad, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned, you were talking about the difference between the FDA and CMS and the difference in the data requirements. What about parallel review? That's something that came up years ago. I don't know if it's being used extensively, if it works. What are your thoughts?
Tim, you want to take a shot?
Yeah, well, I mean, it has worked. It has worked. The one big thing that we've noticed about it is, while there was, you know, I think an initial push by the agency, even internally, to show that it could work, the data that's required for coverage and the data that's required for regulatory approval are still separate, right? You're just talking to the same people at the same time and trying to figure out if you can, you know, de-risk your regulatory strategy. What are the consequences of taking certain endpoints out of clinical studies? And the FDA is not going to change their standards based upon the fact that, oh, we're going to include some additional types of patients or additional health economic endpoints that may put, you know, the statistical drive towards kind of a least burdensome regulatory pathway in jeopardy. You're having those conversations, but neither side is necessarily going to budge on their data requirements. It is something where you can coordinate it so the approval comes at the same time, right? And that has commercial benefits, because then you can line up all of your marketing budgets and you can line up, you know, everything in terms of your field force. You can say the CMS says go, FDA says go, let's all go at the same time. That may, in reality, mean a significant delay on availability, market availability from a regulatory standpoint, because usually in some of those circumstances on the payer side, it can be, you know, 18 months, 2 years, 2.5 years before you can get coverage after you've gotten regulatory approval. And you may have pressure to sell some product. You may have pressure, certainly in that diagnosis related group setting. If you're selling imaging equipment, right, and you've convinced the hospitals that it makes sense, you don't need to convince the payers, because the payers have said it's lump sum payment, hospitals do what you want. Are you going to withhold that to align that timing? Sometimes that can be a really, really tricky thing to do. But that's, I don't know, Brad, if you have a different take on it, the standards are still the same.
Yeah, I think it is a challenge. I mean, the one time I can think of where there was a successful effort that way was originally when the drug-coated stents became available, and payment occurred through CMS about the same time as FDA approval. And so there's also another weird dichotomy in the United States. Frequently, you'll see payers say they won't pay for things until you demonstrate usage. So you've got to have the product on the market and get people using the product, whether it's a device, drug, or anything else, before the payer will go through the process of setting reimbursement rates. Because unfortunately, many times payers' response is, why am I going to waste my time talking to you when I don't know that anyone wants to use your product? I'm not saying that's a fair response. It's just their way to avoid having to work to make decisions.
I would say one other thing about the parallel review process, the formal parallel, Cologuard is an example that went through that process successfully. But the private payers, which is going to be a big population for, screening, a screening population for certainly high risk folks of colon cancer, they're going to be under 65. If you look at when the private payers came along, they didn't all just jump on right away when CMS said go, right? In many cases, it took 6 months, a year, potentially even longer before some of the private payers came around and said that they, in fact, were going to cover it. And in the screening population, that's a big population in colon cancer, for example. It's still a success story in that they were able to have that parallel review and go through that process successfully. But it didn't mean that every single payer in the United States in that highly fractured payer environment was on board right out of the gate as well.
So, gentlemen, we're down to the last few seconds here, and I want to ask you to get your crystal balls out for a minute. This week, we saw that apparently Congress has reached agreement on cost control measures for drug pricing. What do you think the future of drug and medical device pricing looks like? Companies that are developing their products today that are going to be in the market 4 or 5 years from now, what should they be thinking about pricing?
I'll start and give Tim the final word. Again, as I said at the beginning, the United States is by far the largest healthcare market in the world. When you look at that graph, $3.5 trillion per year. Is that sustainable? The healthcare costs in the United States are greater per person per capita than anywhere else in the world, and the results aren't nearly as good. We have a really complicated healthcare system, as we've, I think, illustrated and trying to briefly explain it. And there does need to be simplification, more efficiencies brought through there, whether they're drug costs, healthcare costs, all of those things. So I do think that there's a need for that. But with that being said, I think one point that Tim and I both talked about through here that will never change is if you focus on realizing from day one, you've got to demonstrate the economic benefit of your product. I think that's going to put you in the right position, no matter what country you're in, what payer you're talking to, or anything else. I mean, you really have to focus from the beginning of demonstrating not only a clinical benefit to your product, but also an economic benefit from using it.
Yeah, and I would just say, obviously, there is that pricing pressure. It's probably not something that's going to be completely resolved with any one piece of legislation and any one change in format. It would be precedent setting if they were taking the top 30 drugs and coming up with some sort of reference-based pricing system. That's precedent setting. I understand that. But if you look at the history of healthcare reform, and specifically on Medicare, on the Medicare side, whether it's drugs, devices, reforms are enacted to have a certain achieved effect. Sometimes they achieve that effect. Sometimes they do not achieve. I mean, the DRG-based reform, in the United States to come up with global, that had an effect that was positive, and Medicare has tried to simulate that in the hospital outpatient environment or the ambulatory surgery environment to the best that they can. And in some points, they're creating disincentives for better technologies unknowingly based off of some policy initiatives or different payment structures that they're changing. It's going to take time. If you have, if you feel like you're going to be a target for those therapeutic areas, that's a more immediate threat. More broadly looking at it, I think these things are things that, if you want to look at very long trends, will resolve is the wrong word, but will take time before understanding even the consequences of the reforms and the initiatives that Medicare makes. And I certainly could see a scenario where from somebody says, well, we're limited in what we can do in price, so we're no longer the nasty pharmaceutical company that's squeezing every dollar out of it we possibly can. So our price is set, and we're moving towards a new era there. That may take some pricing, that may take some pressure off of payers to deny coverage in some circumstances. So we'll see, I guess, is always kind of what the impact is, and understanding what the impact might be for your company is an in-depth conversation that I think gets into a much deeper dive into the individual rules and your specialty area and where you're anticipating site of care and the specialty societies that you're going to be advocating with or on behalf.
Great, thank you. Well, gentlemen, Tim, Brad, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really appreciate it. Everybody, thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Brad Stewart and Tim Sheflin talking about the complexity of the U.S. drug market and how you need to prepare and strategize as you're preparing to launch your technologies and products into the market. So thank you for your time this afternoon. This has been the Maryland Tech Council and the Maryland BioHub sponsoring our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.